Welcome to EDUCARE. This lecture is about tax administration, which is an important area of F6 ACCA syllabus. First, we need to define the self-assessment system. It is a system used by HMRC to collect tax. Under this self-assessment system, the onus is placed on the taxpayer to provide information to calculate his or her own tax liability. The taxpayer will be sent a notice to complete a self-assessment tax return annually, and a return must be completed and filed either on paper or online. The deadlines for filing paper and electronic online return for the tax year 21-22. For paper return, the deadline is 31st October 22. And for online return, the deadline is 31st January 23. And in case the HMRC issued a formal notice to file a return and that date is later than 31st October and 31st January, then that date will be considered as the deadline. If that date is later than 31st October or 31st January, then such date would be considered as the deadline. Now in MCQ, for the tax year 21-22, what are the latest dates by which the taxpayer who is an individual and who does not wish to incur a penalty should file a self-assessment tax return on paper or online? So according to the information above, the date for paper return is 31st October 22 and date or deadline for online return is 31st January 23. So this would be our option. The same question can be asked in a different way, like this. For the tax year 21-22, what are the latest dates by which a taxpayer who does not want to incur a penalty should file a self-assessment tax return on paper or on online? So for paper return, this is the date of 31st October 22, and for online return, this is the date of 31st January 23. So it would be A option. Now, what is meant by the filing date and what is meant by the actual filing date? So filing date is 31st January following the end of tax year. So for the year 21-22, the tax year ending date would be 5th April 22 and the filing date would be 31st January 23. And actual filing date means date on which the return is actually filed, submitted. So it would be a date when actually the taxpayer has submitted his file return. Again, filing date is said to be a date which is said to be a date following 31st January following the end of tax year. So if our tax year ends on 5th April 22, this would be the 31st January 23 date, which is said to be the following filing date. Now, due date of amendment to return by the HMRC. Remember, amendment can be made by either party. Amendment can be made by HMRC, amendment can be made by taxpayer also. To correct the obvious error and omission, HMRC can make amendment. And the due date for amendment of return by the HMRC is 9 months of actual filing date. 9 months of actual filing date. So definition of filing date and actual filing date is important because the due date of amendment to the return is based on these dates. If the due date of amendment to the return by HMRC is required from you, this is a date of 9 months of actual filing date. And if you have been asked the due date of amendment to the return by the taxpayer, this is said to be 12 months of filing date. 12 months of filing date. For example, for the tax year 21-22, For the tax year 21-22, the filing date is identified by us as 31st January 23. Then due date of amendment to the return by taxpayer would be 12 months of filing date, means 31st January 24. Now, is deadline the same regardless of whether the return is filed on paper or electronically? Answer is yes, the deadline is same. Now, what details are included in the main tax return form SA100? The SA100 form includes detail of taxpayer name, address, and certain type of investment income. What type of tax are covered in tax return? These are income tax, class 2 and class 4 NIC contribution, and CGT liabilities for the tax year. What is the due date of payment of tax? It is again 31st January following the end of tax year. 31st January following the end of tax year. So again for the year 21-22, the year ending date is 5th April 22 and the due date of payment of tax would be 31st January 23. Now how employees pay their tax liability? Generally under pay as you earn system, but if they receive other taxable income and that are not fully taxable through pay as you earn system, then they will need to complete the tax return. Means if they have more than one source of income and the pay as you earn tax deducted at source doesn't cover all these taxable income, then they have to complete a tax return. What is meant by statement of account? This is said to be HMRC issue a statement of account, which is said to be a reminder of amount owing to HMRC. What the taxpayer has to pay to the HMRC is mentioned in the statement of account. This statement of account sets out the tax charges, any charges of interest or penalties, or any payment already made by the taxpayer. Now the time limit for notifying HMRC of chargeability. Time limit for notifying HMRC of chargeability, where the taxpayer who do not receive a notice to file a return are required to notify HMRC if they have income or chargeable gain on which tax is due. This is the period of 6 months from the end of the tax year in which the liability arises. Again, for example, for the year tax year 21-22, the year ending date would be 5th April 22 and 6 months from the end of the tax year means 5th October 22. Now, what is the due date of payment of capital gain tax? It is again 31st January following the tax year. The question is, Darren made a chargeable gain of 50,000 on the sale of painting on 30th June 21. The date is important. Date is 30 June 21. This was Darren's only disposal in the tax year 21-22. He had previously paid his income tax through deduction at source, so has not had to submit a self-assessment return. The question is, by what date must Darren notify HMRC of his chargeability to capital gain tax? The first question is, by what date Darren notify HMRC of his chargeability to capital gain tax? Here we need to identify what is the year ending date, tax year ending date, and plus 6 months period, and we will get the date by which the notice of chargeability should be served. And second question is, by what date must he pay the capital gain tax liability, and that is 31st January following the end of tax year. So the answer of first question would be, as 30 June 21 is a date of disposal, and this date lie in a tax year 21-22, and the tax year 21-22 ends on 5th April 22, plus 6 months period will give you a date of 5th October 22. So this is the date of by which the notice of chargeability to capital gain tax should be served by the taxpayer. And next is by what date must he pay the capital gain tax liability, and that is following the end of tax year next 31st January, and that will be 31st January 23. So the option would be B, 5th October 22 is the notification date and the payment date is 31st January 23. Now question is return and calculation of tax. Where the return is filed electronically, the calculation of tax liability is automatically provided as a part of online filing process. And where paper return is submitted, HMRC will calculate tax liability on behalf of taxpayer, but if the tax return is submitted by 31st October deadline. If the tax return has been submitted by the due date of 31st October, then HMRC will calculate the tax liability on behalf of taxpayer. What if a self-assessment tax return is not filed by the filing date? Then HMRC may determine the amount of tax due. Now, the question is, can the taxpayer appeal against such determination? So, answer is no. If the taxpayer is not filing his return, not submitting his self-assessment tax return by the due date, then HMRC may determine the amount of tax, and against that determination no appeal can be made. Up to what date determination can be made? A determination can be made at any time within 3 years of filing date. Within 3 years of filing date. Now about records. The taxpayer, the self-employed person, must keep all their records until this is the period of 5 years after the 31st January filing date. So, for example, we can consider that for the tax year 21-22, record must be retained by 31st January 28. Because for the tax year 21-22, the filing date would be 31st January 23, and plus 5-year period will give you a date of 31st January 28. And for other taxpayer, they have to keep the record until, in this regard, they have to consider the 3 dates. First, 12 months after the 31st January filing date, means for the year ended for the tax year 2021, this is the date of 31st January 23. Second, they have to consider the date on which a compliance check into the return is completed. And third, the date on which it becomes impossible for a compliance check to be started. They have to consider these 3 dates, and later of these 3 dates would be the date until which they have to keep the record. And the maximum penalty of each failure is £3,000 per tax year. So this is the part 1 of our lecture, tax administration. In the next part, we will consider further payments and account and so on.